to our bank account.
Do you think that you have somewhere in the statute or the Constitution the authority to control disbursements of a foreign country?
Well, they've agreed to this, and that's the key. They've agreed to this arrangement in which the sanctions that are placed on this oil is what blocks its distribution. So we've agreed to release sanctions and allow the disbursement of the funding as long as they're spending it in a certain way. So understand it's novel, but it's the best.
This may look like a technical debate over sanctions, but it's actually a stress test for how executive power handles money beyond U.S. borders. What's really being tested here is whether control without custody can substitute for clear legal authority. This raises broader questions about where oversight begins when funds never formally enter the Treasury, yet are effectively governed by U.S. conditions. In this video, we'll break down how a workaround becomes policy, why novel arrangements matter, and what this reveals about accountability when foreign assets sit between sanctions and discretion.
Thank you, Chairman, Ranking Member. Secretary, good to see you again. I want to ask about the oil. Under U.S. law, funds received by the government must be deposited with the Treasury. Earlier, you testified that the funds are being held short-term in Qatar and then will move to a Treasury blocked account. What is the statutory authority for the administration relying on Qatar to hold the funds?
It's not our funds. The funds are in an account that's owned and signed. It's an account that belongs to Venezuela, but it has U.S. sanctions as a blocking mechanism on it. And one of the primary reasons why it was in a third country initially, until we could create the mechanism to move it to a U.S. presence, is twofold. One, we have an issue we're working through on recognition. What is exactly, you have to recognize a government, but we don't recognize this government. We recognize the 2015 National Assembly. So we have to find some creative way legally to meet that standard. The other is, frankly, creditors. If any of that money touched a U.S. bank, even if it was an account in the name of the Venezuelans, it would immediately be seized upon by a number of creditors who eventually we'll have to take care of. But in the short term, that would impede the ability of the Venezuelan authorities to receive the funds they need to operate.
So do you have the, I mean, this is what I'm trying to get at, right? Either it's American money, in which case it's subject to the Miscellaneous Receipts Act, and there are all kinds of things that attend to that. You're saying it's Venezuela's money, but it does sound like, according to the EO, according to the president's statements, you are in charge of that money. What authority are you relying on to be in charge, almost in a sort of receivership kind of arrangement, of how funds are both received and expended for a foreign country? Like, wouldn't you have to come to Congress to establish that kind of relationship?
Well, no, because the money never enters our hands. We only control the disbursement of the money. We don't control the actual money in the sense of, like, it comes into our bank account.
Do you think that you have somewhere in the statute or the Constitution the authority to control disbursements of a foreign country?
Well, they've agreed to this, and that's the key. They've agreed to this arrangement in which the sanctions that are placed on this oil is what blocks its distribution. So we've agreed to release sanctions and allow the disbursement of the funding as long as they're spending it in a certain way. So understand it's novel, but it's the best we could come up with in the short term to ensure that they're...
Is there a written agreement that memorializes this?
Yes, I believe there is, and there will have to be one most certainly once we transition that to U.S. accounts.
Secretary, my understanding is the committee doesn't have this agreement.
Well, I can...
If we do or we don't?
Yeah, and you probably wouldn't because it's a Treasury matter. Treasury's handled it, but I can most certainly talk to Treasury about providing you the information.
Also, you're the National Security Advisor, so you do have a role here in coordinating between the departments. So it's not just like you can punt this to Treasury.
Yeah, I just didn't bring the document with me.
I got it.
Okay.
I just want you to land it and get it to the committee because, look, you're being transparent. I think this is novel. I think it's funky. I think it may not even be permissible, but I don't know until I see the document, and I'd like you to just land it for us, if that's all right.
Yeah, no, like I said, and by the way, by the time I get it to you, hopefully we won't even have that account anymore. It'll be in a bit more traditional, where we can use our sanctions as leverage on how the money's being spent.
The moment comes quietly, but it lands with weight. A simple question, repeated with growing precision, hangs in the air of the hearing room. What authority are you relying on? Senator Brian Schatz isn't raising his voice. He doesn't need to, because what he is pressing for is not a political talking point, but something far more fundamental: the legal foundation beneath the actions of the executive branch. Across from him, Secretary Marco Rubio explains a system he himself calls novel. Funds generated from Venezuelan oil, held offshore, controlled indirectly, disbursed conditionally, and governed not by a clear statute passed by Congress, but by a patchwork of sanctions, recognition disputes, and administrative improvisation. In that exchange, we see a rare thing in modern Washington. Not a clash of ideology, but a collision between power and process. Schatz is not arguing about whether the policy goal is justified. He is asking something more uncomfortable. Who decides? Under what law? And with whose consent? The answer, as it unfolds, reveals the quiet expansion of executive authority that often happens far from public view. The funds, Rubio says, are not American money. They belong to Venezuela, yet they are constrained by U.S. sanctions. They do not sit in a U.S. account, yet the United States controls how and when they are released. They are not held by the Treasury, yet Treasury oversees the mechanism. It is a structure designed to solve immediate problems: disputes over diplomatic recognition, exposure to international creditors, and the limits of existing law. But it raises a larger question that no workaround can fully escape. In the American system, power is supposed to follow authority. Authority is supposed to come from law. And law, in turn, is supposed to come from Congress. That is the tension filling the room. Schatz walks carefully through it, step by step, almost like a guide through constitutional terrain. If the money were U.S. funds, it would fall under strict statutory rules. If it is foreign money, then what gives U.S. officials the right to control its disbursement? If the executive branch is acting as a kind of overseer for another nation's resources, shouldn't that arrangement be explicitly authorized by the legislative branch? These are not abstract hypotheticals. They are questions that go to the heart of democratic accountability. Rubio's responses are candid. He does not claim this is a long-standing model. He acknowledges it is unusual. He describes it as the best solution available under difficult circumstances. And in doing so, he reveals something important about modern governance. Increasingly, administrations are forced, or choose, to operate in the gray spaces between statutes, especially in foreign policy, where urgency often outruns legislation. But gray space is where oversight matters most. When Schatz asks for the written agreement, the exchange sharpens. The committee, it appears, has not seen it. The document exists, but it has not yet been shared. It sits somewhere within the machinery of government, shaping decisions, influencing outcomes, and yet remaining outside the direct view of the lawmakers tasked with oversight. This is not framed as defiance. It is framed as procedure. Treasury handles it. Coordination is ongoing. The paperwork can be provided later. Later is doing a lot of work in that sentence, because what this moment exposes is not just a disagreement over Venezuela or sanctions policy. It exposes a broader pattern in which executive power becomes operational first and formally reviewed second, if at all. It shows how national security, financial leverage, and diplomatic complexity can combine to create systems that function effectively while remaining only loosely tethered to explicit authorization. Schatz doesn't accuse. He reflects. He even concedes that transparency appears to be the intent. But he also admits what many viewers are likely thinking. This arrangement feels unusual, it feels uncertain, and until Congress sees the documents and understands the legal rationale, no one can say with confidence whether it fully aligns with the law. That is the quiet drama of this hearing. No shouting, no viral soundbite engineered for outrage, just the slow, methodical pressing of a constitutional question that refuses to go away. In a functioning republic, that question matters more than the policy itself. Because today it is Venezuelan oil funds. Tomorrow it could be another foreign account, another emergency, another novel solution, each one reasonable on its own, each one justified by circumstance. And over time, the exception risks becoming the norm. The American system was designed to prevent that drift. Not by assuming bad intentions, but by demanding clarity, by insisting that power explain itself, by requiring that those who act do so within boundaries that are visible, reviewable, and accountable to the people through their representatives. This hearing reminds us that democracy often hinges, remember, not on grand speeches, but on persistent questions. Questions like, where does this authority come from? Questions that force transparency out of complexity. Questions that slow power down just enough to examine it. And that is why moments like this matter. Not because they resolve everything, but because they keep the system honest. They remind the executive branch that innovation does not replace authorization. They remind Congress that oversight is not optional. And they remind the public that even in the most technical corners of government, the Constitution is still supposed to be the final reference point. If you believe these moments of scrutiny matter, if you believe transparency should never be an afterthought. And if you want to keep watching Power Questioned, not just exercised, subscribe to Liberty Report USA.